This is the PULSAR XBOARD MS. PULSAR's latest keyboard release, but a very unique one as it's a budget-oriented version of the XBOARD QS aimed to compete in the general consumer market instead of the high-end keyboard market like their previous releases. Now, while the board itself is surprisingly good for a mechanical keyboard, there are some interesting aspects to the board's design and performance specs, as PULSAR is advertising that the XBOARD MS has comparable latency to many HE boards, including PULSAR's own PC-MK2HE, while using mechanical switches, not magnetic ones, and retailing for a cheaper price. So in today's video, we're going to talk in depth about PULSAR's latest keyboard and see if this board can truly compete with not only other high-performance mechanical boards, but maybe even HE boards as well, and of course talk about the board's pros and cons in today's episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, I want to say a big thank you to PULSAR, who was kind enough to send over the XBOARD MS for review, and if you enjoy the review and want to see more keyboard reviews here on the channel, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. And if you'd like to support what I do here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and of course the teardown project, consider using my affiliate codes, which are linked down in the video description, or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I used the XBOARD MS for approximately 3 weeks, daily driving the board for both work and gaming use. Over my testing, I only used the board in its stock configuration and with its stock switches. I did briefly test some other mechanical switches to test feel and acoustics, but for all of my actual testing time, I used the board in its stock configuration. For pricing, the XBOARD MS retails for $119.95 USD, $40 cheaper than the PULSAR PC-MK2HE. Currently, the board is only available in a black colorway, but just like we saw with the PC-MK2HE, I assume we'll see a white colorway added in the future. Now, the XBOARD MS's unboxing experience here is unsurprisingly quite similar to the PC-MK2HE's, just with some slight differences. Now, the board comes in a standard-looking PULSAR box, and inside we have the board itself, which is wrapped in a fabric protective wrapper. Unfortunately, the board does not include a dust cover, but given the board's price, this is understandable. Also included in the packaging is a black USB A to C cable, the same type we saw included with the PC-MK2HE. There are also 3 extra switches included, a manual keycap and switch puller, as well as a PULSAR branded sticker and a fairly comprehensive multi-language user manual. And in terms of warranty coverage, as expected for a PULSAR product, the XBOARD MS comes with a 2-year warranty. Now, to preface this little section on in-game performance, I wanted to reiterate that this board is not designed to compete with the countless Hall effect magnetic boards that are available on the market, and even though the board's specs are similar to an HE board, it's designed to compete with the more general consumer grade boards like the one you'd find in a Walmart or your local Best Buy, and as such, I'm going to refrain from comparing the board to other HE boards as much as possible in this review, and instead compare it to other mechanical boards. Alright, and with that little precursor out of the way, let's talk performance. Over my testing, despite this being a mechanical board, the XBOARD MS performed quite well. It's definitely one of the best gaming focused mechanical boards I've used to date, and it's the closest I've seen a mechanical board come to an HE board in terms of performance. But that said, it did take me a week or two to get adjusted to the stock switches pre-travel, as they actuated 2mm of travel, not 0.2mm like my HE boards, so there was an adjustment period for sure, but after a couple days of use, the board actually felt quite good. The board also has this really nifty feature of swapping its mode via a plus and X button, which are located at the top of the board's framing, which switches it between an office and gaming mode specifically. So using the board for both work and gaming was a breeze, but I will say the general use experience for the board wasn't the most ideal, and I'll go over why later in this video. But while this dual mode feature was really useful, I did have one weird issue where whenever I'd swap the board's modes, it'd refresh all the other USB devices that were plugged into my PC. So if I was on a Discord call and I swapped the board from office to gaming mode, my mic would cut out for a few seconds, which was quite annoying. Now, I'm 99% sure this is a firmware bug, as I've used other devices with mode toggles like this and they don't cause all my USB devices to black out, and I have no doubt this will be fixed with a firmware update in the near future. And speaking of firmware updates, the board uses the same bibimbap web-based software that the PC-MK2HE used, which is one of the better web-based keyboard softwares I've used to date, so adjusting the board's lighting profiles and of course updating the board is pretty easy, but I'll talk more about that later in this video. But overall, the XBOARD MS performed quite well over my testing, much better than I expected a mechanical board to do in all honesty, and compared to other mechanical boards I have in my collection, the board is without a doubt the best gaming optimized mechanical board I've used, and to be honest, my only real issues with the board, aside from the weird USB blackout issue, is that the general use and typing optimized experience for this board isn't the greatest, but we're going to talk more about this later in this video. Now, in terms of build quality and QC, overall the XBoard MS is quite well constructed, but there are definitely some aspects of the board that could be improved. Now, the board's top and bottom housing is made out of ABS plastic, which admittedly does feel a little cheap, but the aluminum positioning plate inside the board helps to keep the board's framing semi-rigid, enough that it doesn't affect the board's performance or typing feel. But sadly, due to the framing material, the XBoard MS is very light, almost to a fault, as again it feels cheaper than other mechanical boards with aluminum housings. Another downside to the board's lightness is that despite it having these two long rubber base feet, the board can be moved quite easily. If the board had a little more weight and heft to it, maybe by an internal weight or a heavier housing material, these feet would anchor the board very strongly, but in its current form the board is a little too easy to shift and move around from my personal taste. But aside from the base feel, I don't have any other noticeable issues with the board's build quality, and for a consumer grade board it does feel quite good. And in terms of QC, aside from the issues I mentioned earlier where swapping between the gaming and office modes would temporarily disable some of my USB devices, the only other issue I have with the board is that the stabilizers that Pulsar use for the larger keys, specifically the spacebar, have a lot of wobble to them, more than I've seen on any other mechanical board to date, which is very disappointing. But on the plus side, the stabilization of the smaller keys is quite good, and over my testing I didn't run into any other QC issues with any of the board's keys or any other aspect to the board. Now, as I alluded to earlier, despite this board being a mechanical board, not only does the board have more performance features than you commonly find on similar mechanical boards, it also has many performance aspects you'll find on AG boards. But starting off with layout, the XBoard MS is a TKL board in an ANSI layout with 88 keys, one of which is a programmable key which is located above the backspace key, which you can use for custom programming, which is a nice little thing to see. The board also has a control knob which you can use for adjusting the volume as well as the board's RGB. The board is using Cherry MX2A red switches, which feel quite good for mechanical switches, and we'll talk more about them later in this video. And the board is also hot swap, which is a feature you rarely see on consumer grade mechanical boards, so you can swap in your preferred 3 or 5 pin switches into the XBoard MS if you want to customize the typing feel of the board, which is a fantastic feature to see. The board's switch plate and PCB is also gasket mounted, so it has a slight flex when pressure is applied to the keys, which slightly improves the typing experience. The board is also designed with 3 layers of foam and padding on the inside for sound absorption, which does improve the board's stock acoustics to a degree, but there are some other aspects to the board that do hamper the audio feedback, but we'll talk more about them later. And as expected for a consumer grade board, the XBoard MS does support full spectrum RGB lighting with 16.8 million colors and 44 preset modes, which you can fully customize via the board's web-based software. And as I just mentioned, the XBoard MS also supports 2 operational modes, a gaming and an office mode, which you can toggle between via the large X and plus buttons at the top of the board. In the gaming mode, the board will run at full power, utilizing its max scan rate of 35K and also its max polling rate of 8K. In the office mode, the board scan rate will drop to 10K and the polling rate will drop to 1K Hz. And additionally, aside from the 2 operational modes, the board also supports 3 additional profiles. In terms of latency, the board is boasting a 0.16 ms response time in the gaming mode, which is ever so slightly above the 0.125 ms response time we see on most HE boards, which is quite impressive for a mechanical board, but there is a little bit of an asterisk to this latency value here, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. And lastly, in terms of connectivity, unlike many other consumer grade mechanical boards, the XBoard MS is only usable over wired USB-C connectivity. There is no 2.4 GHz wireless or Bluetooth connectivity available on this board, but this is understandable considering you can't achieve a 0.16 ms latency and 35K Hz scan rate and 8K polling over wireless or Bluetooth. This is only possible over wired USB-C. Now before I move on, I want to quickly talk about the little asterisks I mentioned about the XBoard MS's 0.16 millisecond latency. Now to be clear, Pulsar isn't lying about the board's latency values, but this number is not including the board's physical latency, which is caused by the board's switches. Now unlike AG boards which support magnetic switches that have adjustable actuation ranges, the stock switches on the XBoard MS, since they're mechanical, have a set actuation point of 2 mm halfway through the switch's total 4 mm travel range. Because of this, If you put the XBoard MS and say the PCMK2HE side by side and set the PCMK2 switches to actuated 2mm, the boards would perform roughly the same in terms of latency, as both boards have roughly the same level of physical latency. But if you adjust the actuation point of the PCMK2 switches to 0.2mm or even 1mm, it'll have less physical travel and thus less physical latency, leading to a faster response time. Now in reality, how much difference does this extra physical latency make? Not much, as realistically speaking, an extra 10 to 20 milliseconds of physical latency isn't going to massively impact the board's performance, and this is something you'll only notice if you're coming from an HE board to the XBoard MS, hence the adjustment period I mentioned earlier in this video. But to be clear, the board does still perform extremely well, and it wipes the floor with other consumer grade mechanical boards with ease, which is exactly what PULSAR aimed to do with this board, but it's not going to outperform an HE board despite this advertised 0.16 millisecond latency due to the physical latency. Now for the board stock switches, as I mentioned earlier, PULSAR went with the Cherry MX2A red switches, which are a quite well performing switch considering their mechanical nature. In terms of their specific specs, the switch type is linear. They have an initial force of 45.8 gram force, a total travel range of 4mm, a pre-travel range of 2mm. They are pre-lubed out of the box. They do have an MX style stem. Their top housing is clear plastic and their base housing is solid plastic. They are a 5-pin switch, and they are rated for 100 million plus actuations. Now, as I mentioned earlier, since I came from using an HE board, one that was set to a 0.2mm actuation point, it took me a week or so to get accustomed to the switch's 2mm actuation points, but when I got accustomed to the stock switches, they felt pretty good and performed quite well over my testing, but I definitely say they're more suited for gaming use. They are usable for typing oriented tasks as well, but they felt the best for gaming in my opinion. And rest assured, if you're currently using a mechanical board and you're considering upgrading to the XBoard MS, the common actuation point for most, if not all, mechanical switches is around the 2mm mark, so you likely won't experience any adjustment period like I did going to the XBoard MS. But as I mentioned earlier, the board does support hot swap, a feature rarely seen on consumer grade boards, and the board supports both 3 and 5-pin switch types. So if you dislike the board's stock switches or want to use a switch with a shorter pre-travel to better utilize the board's 0.16 millisecond latency, you can swap in whatever kind of mechanical switch you'd like here on the XBoard MS. Alright, and in terms of the XBoard MS's keycaps, PULSAR is using the same double-shot PBT style keycaps here we saw used on the PC MK2HE. Now these keycaps do feel pretty good to use, as I mentioned earlier, and they do have a semi-granular texturing on their surface, so they're decently grippy, but since they're the same keycap type as the ones we saw on the PC MK2HE, they also can feel a little slippery when exposed to oils or sweat. It's also worth noting that the keycaps are solid and non-shine through, so the board's lighting will mainly be accented as it won't shine through the keys, but if you want to use shine through keycaps or a different color or just grippier keycaps, since the stock switches use MX style stems, the board will be compatible with most if not all types of aftermarket keycaps. Now in terms of ergonomics, the XBoard MS is a taller board than most, being quite tall at its front and quite aggressively tilted, much more so than the PC MK2HE. Now PULSAR doesn't state any specific spec for the board's angling, but the board is tilted at roughly the same angle as my Shortcut Studio Bridge 75, which has a more aggressive typing angle of 6.5 degrees, so I assume that the XBoard MS has a similar typing angle, but again this is just an estimation on my end. Now admittedly, this angle is a little more aggressive than most mechanical boards you'll find on the market, and it can take some time to get accustomed to it, but if you have smaller hands, I would highly recommend using a wrist rest here, as the angling might be too aggressive for a comfortable usage experience. But unlike most if not all consumer grade mechanical boards, the XBoard MS doesn't support any kind of height adjustment, but considering how aggressive the stock angling is, I doubt anyone will actually want to increase the board's angle, but if you want to, you'll need to use some kind of aftermarket prop to adjust the height of the XBoard MS. This more aggressive typing angle is why I say the board is more gaming focused, as for gaming use it's fine for the most part, but for typing and office use I found myself getting fatigued much faster than I usually do on less tilted boards, which is surprising considering I have larger hands. So even though the board has dedicated modes for both work and office / general use, I found myself grabbing other less aggressively tilted boards for writing and general use. And in terms of keycap profile, the XBoard MS's keycaps are using the expected cherry-like profile, which is good for both gaming and general use and comfortable to type on, but again, the board's ergonomics do make it kinda hard to actually use this board for long-term typing. It's much better suited for gaming use. And in terms of acoustics, due to the board's gasket mounting and layers of dampening foam, the board's stock acoustics are okay for a gaming board, but they fall short compared to other general office use optimized boards. The reason for this is because the board's upper and lower framing is made out of ABS plastic, and because there's a lot of empty space in the board's housing, specifically towards the back here, the board has a hollowness to it, as the switch's audio feedback echoes within the board, more so towards the top row than the bottom row, but still to a noticeable degree. Now for gaming use, the hollowness of the board isn't really noticeable per se, but when using the board for typing or general use, it's much more noticeable. To better explain this, here's how the XBoard MS sounds in its stock configuration. Now, to be clear, this is 100% a super niche nitpick, as again, this is more of a gaming optimized board, but keep in mind the board has this much feedback with linear switches. With clackier switches such as Cherry Blues, I do think the acoustics of this board would be very bad due to its hollowness. But again, this is very much up to personal preference, and again, this is absolutely a nitpick on my side, but something I still wanted to note in this review regardless. And in terms of lighting, as I mentioned earlier, the XBoard MS supports 16.8 million colors via the board's self-positioned light nodes under the switch's sockets. The board also supports 44 predefined lighting effects, which you can customize either via the board's onboard shortcuts or via the web-based software. Now, as I mentioned earlier, since the board's keycaps are solid and non-shine-through, the board's lighting will be more accented than primary, but it does add just enough RGB to the board so it's not overpowering, which I quite like. And again, if you want to highlight the board's lighting better, you can use shine-through or putting keycaps on the board to more emphasize the board's lighting. And for software, just like the PCMK2HE, the XBoard MS is using PULSAR's Bibimbap web-based software, which is one of the better web-based softwares available on the market. Now, just like all other types of web-based softwares, this Bibimbap software is only available via Chromium-based browsers such as Chrome, Opera, Edge, etc. Now, the layout of the software is the same that we saw before, being split into 5 tabs. The first of which is the Lighting tab, in which you can configure the board's lighting either manually or by selecting one of the board's preset profiles. You can also assign the lighting per profile and disable or enable the caps, scroll, and win key indicators as well. The next tab is the Key Map tab, in which you can configure the board's key bindings or assign alternative binds to the keys, including the extra programmable one located above the backspace key. Another great feature I'm very happy to see return again is that you can swap the XBoard MS's board layout to Dvorak, Coleman, or Workman layouts with a single click, which is a very underrated feature I wish we saw on more keyboards. In this tab, we can also adjust the function of the control knob if you want to change its default behavior of controlling volume or the board's lighting. The next tab we have is the Advanced tab, in which you can configure some of the additional performance settings for the XBoard MS, such as configuring the game mode behavior and enabling Quick Tap. The software also does support a macro editor, which is pretty self-explanatory. And lastly, we have the Settings tab, in which you can adjust the board's language, enable or disable N-key rollover in the gaming mode specifically, and manually alter the board's polling rates. So if you notice that your system is having FPS hitches in the game mode, you can lower the board's polling rate here, but keep in mind this will affect the board's latency. There is also a setting to factory reset the XBoard MS and links to Pulsar's social media pages and support pages, and lastly there is a tab to update the board's firmware. Now the update process isn't as clean as it is on other boards such as the mel0n, but it's well explained at least. But overall the XBoard MS's software is pretty solid. Again, it's one of the better software implementations available on the market, and I'm sure we'll see its user experience improve even more in the future. Alright, well in closing, overall for the XBoard MS being a mechanical board and one that's quite competitively priced, I'm actually quite impressed with this board. I'll admit my expectations were quite low for this board, but this board really surprised me. Sure, the board has some aspects that could be improved, specifically its acoustics and typing angle, and of course its stock switches, as the current ones don't really utilize the board's latency that well, but when compared to other mechanical gaming boards, it's without a doubt better than every other mechanical board I've personally tested to date in terms of performance. Again, it's not the best feeling board for general use as I mentioned earlier, but it's without a doubt the best gaming optimized mechanical keyboard I've used to date, and when compared to the offerings by other more consumer focused brands, the XBoard MS beats out every other mechanical board both in terms of price and of course performance. But all that said, is it better than an HE board? No, obviously not, and I don't think that's going to be a surprise to anyone, as boards like the Lumen Key mel0n or PCMK2 are better in almost every way aside from layout in my opinion, but again, Pulsar isn't trying to compete with HE boards here with the XBOARD MS. This board is aimed at consumer grade mechanical boards, and I do think they've done an excellent job at kind of cornering that market here, as you'll be hard pressed to find another mechanical keyboard that offers the same performance as the XBOARD MS within the same price range from any other consumer grade brands on the market. But if you'd like to learn more about the PULSAR XBOARD MS, you can find its product page linked down in the video description. Alright, and with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Big thank you again to PULSAR for sending over the XBOARD MS for review. I greatly appreciate it, and this was actually a surprisingly fun keyboard to review despite its mechanical nature. Big thank you to our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you'd like to support the mel0n Review and of course the Teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube or use code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, and Mech Keys to save yourself a little bit off your order and help directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the PULSAR XBOARD MS, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.